A 25-year-old woman did not come home from her closing shift at the Roy Rogers restaurant in Bucks County. Her parents knew immediately that something was wrong. Detectives arrived at the locked building and found her body on the kitchen floor in a pool of blood, a butcher knife embedded in her neck, and a trash bag pulled over her head. Several suspects surfaced within hours, but the physical evidence was almost non-existent, and the case went unsolved. 15 years later, a single detail visible in the original crime scene photographs, overlooked by everyone for more than a decade, forced investigators to scrap their original theory and identify the killer no one had seriously considered. Terry Lynn Brooks was born on September 13, 1958, in Pennsylvania. She was the oldest of 4 children in the Brooks family and assisted her parents with the care of her younger siblings, starting from an early age. After completing high school, she enrolled in college and simultaneously held positions in multiple cafes and restaurants. During this period, she determined that the restaurant industry aligned with her long-term professional goals and aimed to advance into senior management at a major national chain. At one restaurant where she worked, she met Alfred Scott Keefe, who was employed there as a cook. The two began dating. Keefe proposed marriage shortly afterward, and the couple made plans for a wedding ceremony along with a honeymoon in Hawaii. By early 1984, Brooks, aged 25, had secured a position as night manager at the Roy Rogers restaurant, located at the intersection of Lincoln Highway and Oxford Valley Road in Fairless Hills, Falls Township, Bucks County, Pennsylvania. The promotion required her to handle closing shifts that extended past midnight. Brooks remained committed to her career progression despite the late hours. She and Keefe, then 22, were actively seeking their first shared apartment. But until that arrangement was finalized, Brooks continued residing with her parents, George and Betty Brooks, in the Falls Township area. On February 3, 1984, Brooks reported for her standard closing shift at the Roy Rogers. All other employees completed their duties and departed the premises, leaving Brooks alone to perform the required closing procedures, secure the building, and prepare the restaurant for the following day's operations. Keefe had previously stated that he routinely stopped by the restaurant late at night to check on Brooks because he expressed concern about her being alone with the day's cash receipts. On this specific night, Keefe went to bed early at his parents' home in Warminster because he had an early morning shift scheduled at his own restaurant job. Brooks was expected to arrive home around 2 a.m. At approximately 6 a.m., on February 4, 1984, Keefe drove past the Brooks family residence on his route to work and observed that her car was not parked in the driveway. He stopped at the house, entered, and spoke with George and Betty Brooks, who confirmed they had not seen their daughter since the previous evening. They inspected her bedroom and found the bed still made with no indication that she had returned. The items Brooks normally carried to work were also absent. George Brooks immediately telephoned the Roy Rogers restaurant. The morning shift manager who answered informed him that police were already present at the scene because Brooks had been discovered dead inside the locked building. The morning manager had arrived shortly before 6 o'clock a.m. to open the restaurant and entered the kitchen area where he found Brooks's body lying on her back on the red-tiled floor in a large pool of blood. A butcher knife from the restaurant's kitchen was embedded in her neck. A plastic trash can liner had been pulled over her head. Brooks was still wearing her short purple winter coat. Her purse had been emptied onto the floor beside her with the cash removed. Her shoes had been knocked off during the struggle and were positioned against a nearby wall. The restaurant safe in the manager's office was open, and approximately $2,500 in cash was missing. The drive-through window had been lifted open from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry at any point on the premises. Falls Township police officers, including Detective Tim Stefan and Officer Nelson Whitney, responded and processed the scene as a robbery homicide. Fingerprints were lifted throughout the restaurant, but the high daily volume of customers and employees made immediate isolation of the perpetrator's prints impractical. Crime scene technicians collected blood evidence, the trash bag, the knife, and other items. The medical examiner, Halbert Fillinger Jr., performed the autopsy and documented the following injuries: extensive abrasions and bruises across the body, including black and blue marks, hand-shaped impressions around the neck consistent with manual strangulation, repeated blows to the head that produced a brain hemorrhage and severed a bone. In the back of the neck, resulting in paralysis from the neck down while Brooks remained conscious, a deep stab wound to the neck inflicted with the butcher knife, the tip of which bent upon striking the floor beneath her, indicating substantial force, defensive wounds including a cut on her right, ring finger, and skin particles along with blood found under her fingernails. Moisture inside the trash bag confirmed that Brooks was still breathing when the bag was placed over her head. The official cause of death was asphyxiation. The medical examiner concluded that the assault had been prolonged and deliberate rather than instantaneous. Investigators noted that Brooks remained in her coat, suggesting the attack occurred while she was still engaged in closing duties or had been interrupted before completing them. The open safe, missing cash, emptied purse, and partially open drive-through window supported an initial theory of a staged robbery. Restaurant robberies occurred with some frequency in the region during that period, yet the level of sustained violence was atypical. Police therefore examined the possibility that the perpetrator knew Brooks personally. Keefe was interviewed as the fianc early in the process. He reported that he had gone to bed early on February 3 and had only become aware of Brooks' absence when he drove past the family home the next morning. George and Betty Brooks described Keefe as kind and caring, with no reported arguments in the relationship, and stated that the couple had been actively planning the wedding and honeymoon. Police found no basis to detain him at that stage. Keefe later attended Brooks's funeral and signed the guest register using his full name, Alfred Scott Keefe. Interviews conducted with restaurant employees indicated that Brooks performed her managerial duties in a strict but fair manner. One former cook, Steve Daly, an ex-Marine whom Brooks had terminated weeks earlier following a temper tantrum and verbal confrontation, was identified as a person of interest. Daly had returned to the restaurant as a customer after his dismissal, an action co-workers viewed as deliberate harassment. During questioning, Daly acknowledged disliking Brooks and stated that if she had not been a woman, he would have struck her. He provided an alibi claiming he had attempted to enter a nightclub on the night of the murder, but staff there could not corroborate his presence. Daly submitted to a polygraph examination and registered no deception. Police also reviewed every employee who had worked the evening shift on February 3. Fingerprints from one worker appeared on the roll of trash bags, and on the drive-through window, the employee explained that he routinely handled trash bags at the end of each shift and supplied a verified alibi confirming he had left the premises before Brooks. 2 weeks after the murder, an assistant manager at a nearby Roy Rogers location was attacked by an unidentified man who emerged from the bathroom, beat her, and fled. The victim survived but could not provide a description, and no physical evidence was recovered. Approximately 2 weeks later, in Scranton, Pennsylvania, roughly 130 miles distant, a restaurant employee named Kathy was robbed and stabbed to death by an intruder who had waited until she was alone after closing. Scranton authorities arrested an employee from that restaurant who admitted to robbing his own workplace, but killing the victim when she could not open the safe. The suspect refused to cooperate with Bucks County investigators, and his fingerprints did not match any evidence from the Brooks crime scene. With no physical matches and no viable leads, the case entered a cold status despite ongoing but fruitless efforts in the ensuing months. In 1998, a new chief of police, Arnold Connelline, directed a comprehensive review of all unsolved homicides within the department. Detectives Lori Markle and Nelson Whitney reopened the Brooks file. By that time, forensic DNA technology had progressed to the point where previously collected biological evidence could be analyzed. Samples preserved from 1984, including skin and blood recovered from under Brooks's fingernails, biological material from beneath the handle of the murder knife, and tissue associated with the defensive wound on her right ring finger, yielded a complete male DNA profile. No national DNA database was available for comparison at the time, so investigators re-interviewed individuals previously connected to the case and requested voluntary reference samples. During this phase, detectives consulted the former restaurant manager and presented him with original crime scene photographs to refresh his recollection. The manager observed a detail that had remained unnoticed for 14 years. Brooks maintained a meticulous closing routine developed over time. She consistently tidied her desk, returned documents and office supplies to their designated locations, and emptied the ashtray in the manager's office prior to departure. None of these tasks had been completed in the photographs, indicating that Brooks had been interrupted well before finishing her assigned duties. This observation altered the investigative premise. The original theory had assumed the perpetrator confronted Brooks as she was exiting the building. The unfinished routine established that the killer had been inside the locked restaurant while Brooks was still actively working, and that she must have known and trusted the individual sufficiently to admit him. Focus therefore shifted to Brooks's immediate personal circle. Investigators located Cindy Bradney, a close friend and former co-worker who had not been interviewed during the 1984 inquiry. Bradney disclosed that approximately 1 week prior to the murder, Brooks had confided that she was contemplating ending the engagement due to Keefe's escalating jealousy and controlling behavior. Keefe had demanded constant knowledge of her whereabouts, resented her career advancement at Roy Rogers while remaining dissatisfied with his own employment, and responded with aggression when challenged. Brooks had also told Bradney that Keefe's late-night visits to the restaurant were motivated by surveillance rather than concern for her safety. Brooks had withheld these concerns from her parents, who had therefore characterized the relationship in uniformly positive terms during the initial investigation. By 1999, Keefe, then 37, had married, fathered a child, divorced, and returned to live with his parents in the same Warminster residence he had occupied in 1984. To avoid alerting him, detectives conducted surveillance and recovered several Newport cigarette butts from trash he placed at the curb. Keefe was the sole smoker in the household. Laboratory analysis extracted saliva DNA from the cigarette filters that matched the unknown male profile obtained from under Brooks's fingernails, the knife handle, and the defensive wound on her right ring finger. On February 4th, 1999, the 15th anniversary of the murder, detectives brought Keefe in for questioning without disclosing the DNA results. He initially restated his 1984 account. When asked to submit to a polygraph examination, he consented, but the examiner identified deception on critical questions. Confronted with the discrepancies, Keefe began to provide additional statements. He admitted traveling to the Roy Rogers after other employees had left, knocking on the door, and being admitted by Brooks. An argument ensued when Brooks informed him she wished to terminate the engagement. Keefe struck her, knocked her to the concrete floor, and repeatedly banged her head against it, producing the brain hemorrhage and paralysis. He attempted manual strangulation without success. Observing the kitchen knife that had fallen during the altercation, he stabbed her in the neck. Realizing she remained alive, he retrieved a trash can liner and pulled it over her head until she suffocated. To simulate a robbery, he removed cash from the safe and Brooks's purse and exited through the drive-through window. The following morning, he deliberately drove past the Brooks residence to stage the appearance of discovering her absence. In one written statement, Keefe claimed Brooks had swung the knife at him first and that he had acted in self-defense. Physical evidence contradicted that assertion. Keefe was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and robbery. In 2000, he entered a formal guilty plea. On June 6, 2000, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole and was incarcerated at the State Correctional Institution at Albion in western Pennsylvania, where he remains. George Brooks, Terry's father, filed a civil lawsuit against the Roy Rogers management and its parent company, Marriott Corporation, asserting that the restaurant was situated in an area with a documented history of thefts, had experienced prior robberies, and had failed to implement adequate security measures or issue warnings to employees working alone at night. Public records do not specify the final resolution of the civil action. The DNA match derived from the cigarette butts, combined with the previously overlooked detail of the incomplete closing routine, supplied the conclusive link that resolved the case after 15 years. The Vidocq Society had reviewed the file and suggested verifying potential romantic connections through the funeral guest register, which ultimately directed attention toward the name Keefe, after Brooks' parents recalled a similar-sounding individual. All elements of the investigation, from the initial crime scene processing through the 1999 DNA confirmation and confession, relied exclusively on documented physical evidence, witness statements, and forensic analysis available in official records and contemporaneous news accounts. No additional verifiable events, statements, or outcomes exist in the public domain beyond those incorporated here.